Ethan Lancaster wasn't used to unexpected things happening in his life. Everything he did was meticulously planned, organized, and controlled down to the finest detail. At 34, he was one of the most powerful men in the country, a billionaire CEO who had built Lancaster Enterprises into a global empire. People feared him, respected him, envied him, but no one dared to cross him. He was a man of precision, of discipline, someone who expected nothing less than perfection. Which was why, when he found a cleaning lady sleeping inside the executive restroom at nearly 1 a.m, he was both irritated and intrigued. He had been working late as usual. His schedule rarely allowed for personal time, and he preferred it that way. Work was predictable, numbers made sense, and business deals didn't come with the messy complications of emotions. But tonight he was frustrated. A multi-billion-dollar deal with an overseas partner was hanging by a thread, and he needed a break before he lost his temper. So, he had decided to step away from his desk, stretch his legs, and head to the restroom to splash some cold water on his face. What he didn't expect was to find someone else inside. At first, he thought the stall was empty, but then he heard it, a slow, steady breathing. His sharp blue eyes immediately scanned the room, and that was when he saw her. A woman curled up in the corner, fast asleep, her back against the stall wall. She was wearing a gray cleaning uniform, her body hunched as if trying to make herself as small as possible. A bucket of cleaning supplies sat untouched beside her, and in her arms, she clutched a thin, worn-out jacket that barely seemed to provide any warmth. Ethan's jaw tightened. He was about to call security when, instead, he found himself pausing. Something about the sight of her, so vulnerable, so exhausted, made him hesitate. "Excuse me." His voice was deep, commanding, a tone that made boardrooms go silent and executives scramble to do his bidding. The woman stirred, a soft sound escaping her lips as she jerked awake. Her brown eyes snapped open, wide with panic as she realized where she was. She scrambled to her feet, rubbing at her eyes and pushing back strands of messy brown hair. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," she stammered, blinking rapidly as if trying to chase away the exhaustion weighing on her. I didn't mean to fall asleep. I was just..." She trailed off as her gaze landed on him, her face turning pale. Ethan Lancaster. She had seen him before, of course. His face was everywhere. The news, business magazines, television interviews. But seeing him in person was something else entirely. He was taller than she expected, his tailored suit fitting him perfectly, his chiseled features as sharp as the ice in his blue eyes. And right now, those eyes were locked onto her with an intensity that made her stomach drop. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice unreadable. She swallowed hard. Claire Bennett." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "You work here?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I'm part of the night shift cleaning staff." "And you're sleeping on the job?" Claire's breath caught. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her uniform as shame burned through her. "No, sir. I wasn't trying to. I was just so tired, and She stopped herself, realizing excuses wouldn't help her situation. Taking a deep breath, she lifted her chin slightly. "I work 2 jobs, sir. I haven't been getting much sleep lately." "It won't happen again, I swear." Ethan said nothing at first, just studied her. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Maybe more groveling, maybe tears. But instead she stood her ground despite the fear in her eyes. Most people cowered before him. He didn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "You're fired." Claire's heart dropped. "No," she whispered. "I don't tolerate laziness," Ethan continued, his voice like steel. "Pack your things." Claire's breathing quickened. She couldn't lose this job. She needed this job. Rent was due in 2 weeks. Her little brother, Danny, was counting on her. She had already stretched every dollar she had, juggling shifts between 2 different jobs just to survive. If she lost this one, she didn't know how she would manage. "Please," she said, stepping forward. "I need this job. I swear it won't happen again. I'll work harder. I'll take extra shifts. I don't give second chances, Ethan cut her off. Claire clenched her fists. A lump formed in her throat, but she refused to let the tears fall. Then I'll work without pay for a week, she blurted out. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Claire's heart pounded. Let me prove to you that I'm not lazy, she said firmly. Just 1 week. If I disappoint you again, I'll leave without another word. Ethan narrowed his eyes. No one had ever dared to negotiate with him like this. Not employees, not business partners, and certainly not a cleaning lady. But there was something about her, about the way she held her ground despite knowing he had all the power, that made him pause. 1 week, he said finally. But if I catch you slacking off again, you're gone. Relief flooded through Claire's body. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked out of the restroom, his mind racing. Why had he agreed to this? Why had he, Ethan Lancaster, the man who never gave second chances, just let a cleaning lady negotiate with him? And more importantly, why, for the first time in years, did he feel something other than cold indifference? As he stepped into his office and sat back at his desk, he found himself distracted, not by the billion-dollar deal at stake, not by the countless emails waiting for his response, but by the memory of a pair of determined brown eyes staring up at him. Claire Bennett. He had a feeling this wasn't the last time she would surprise him. Claire could still feel the weight of Ethan Lancaster's piercing blue gaze even after he left the restroom. Her entire body was tense, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had expected him to fire her on the spot. Most people in his position would have. But for some reason, he had given her a second chance. Under strict conditions, of course. 1 week. 1 week to prove that she wasn't lazy, that she was worth keeping. She couldn't afford to waste this opportunity. She had no safety net, no backup plan. If she lost this job, she had no idea how she would manage rent, food, and her little brother's school fees. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her cleaning supplies and got back to work, scrubbing the restroom floors harder than necessary as if trying to erase her embarrassment. The exhaustion still clung to her bones, but she forced herself to push through. She had survived worse. By the time she finished the entire floor, her muscles ached, and her eyes burned with fatigue, but she didn't stop until everything was spotless. It was nearly 3 in the morning when she finally clocked out, dragging herself home to her tiny apartment. She barely had time to sleep before her alarm blared at 6. Claire groaned but didn't hesitate to get up. She had a shift at the diner before coming back to Lancaster Enterprises for the night shift. It was a brutal schedule, but she had no choice. By the time she returned to the skyscraper that evening, exhaustion was already settling into her bones. But as she stepped into the building, she straightened her spine and forced herself to stay sharp. She couldn't afford another mistake. To her surprise, when she entered the janitor's closet to grab her supplies, she found a note taped to one of the shelves. Report to my office before your shift. Ethan Lancaster. Her breath caught. Why did he want to see her? Had he changed his mind? Was he going to fire her anyway? Nerves twisted in her stomach as she took the elevator up to the top floor. When she reached his office, she hesitated for only a moment before knocking. Come in, came his deep voice. Claire pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was massive, all glass windows and sleek black furniture, with a view that overlooked the entire city. Ethan sat behind a huge mahogany desk, his suit crisp, his expression unreadable. You wanted to see me, sir? She asked, keeping her voice steady. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment before speaking. You're still here. She frowned slightly. You told me I had a week to prove myself. His lips quirked, almost as if he were amused. Most people wouldn't have come back after being caught sleeping on the job. Claire lifted her chin slightly. Most people don't have as much to lose as I do. Something flickered in his eyes, but it was gone too fast for her to decipher. Sit, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Hesitantly, she did. He slid a folder across the desk. I had HR pull up your records. Claire's stomach clenched. You've been working here for 3 months, he continued. Never taken a sick day. Never called in late. Your supervisor said you're one of the hardest workers on the team. So tell me, Claire, why were you sleeping on the floor last night? Her fingers curled slightly against her lap. I already told you. I work 2 jobs. Sometimes it's hard to keep up. His gaze didn't waver. Where else do you work? The Sunset Diner. The one on 5th Avenue. She nodded. Ethan was silent for a moment, as if processing the information. Then, to her utter shock, he pulled out his phone and started typing something. Claire frowned. What are you doing? Checking their labor policies. Her mouth fell open slightly. You can't just look that up. Ethan smirked. I can do whatever I want. She bristled. That's an invasion of privacy. He ignored her, his eyes flicking over whatever information he had found. They're paying you minimum wage. You work 10-hour shifts plus overtime. No benefits. No insurance. He looked up at her. And you're still working here. How much debt are you in? Heat flooded Claire's face. That's none of your business. Ethan raised an eyebrow. It is if it affects your performance at my company. She let out a frustrated breath. I don't have debt, but I do have bills. Rent. My little brother's school fees. She exhaled sharply. Look, I know I messed up, but I need this job. And I'll prove to you that I deserve it. For a moment, Ethan just watched her, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. All right, Claire. You want to prove yourself? Fine. I have a task for you. Her stomach tightened. What kind of task? He smirked slightly. Something more challenging than scrubbing floors. Claire frowned. I don't understand. Ethan stood and walked over to a sleek bar cart near the window, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. He took a sip before turning back to her. Starting tomorrow, you'll be working directly under me. Claire blinked. What? I want to see how capable you really are. His smirk deepened. Congratulations, Claire. You've just been promoted. Her heart slammed against her chest. But I don't know anything about office work. You'll learn. This doesn't make any sense. Ethan studied her, his gaze sharp. It does to me. Claire stared at him, completely thrown. Last night, she had been inches away from getting fired. Now, he was offering her a position working directly for him. Didn't make sense. Bliss. Her stomach twisted. Was this some kind of game to him? Was he testing her? Ethan smirked as if reading her thoughts. You have a week, Claire. Impress me. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She had no idea what she had just gotten herself into. Claire could barely process Ethan Lancaster's words. Starting tomorrow, you'll be working directly under me. The statement echoed in her mind as she sat across from him in his pristine office, gripping the arms of the leather chair as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. This had to be a joke. Test. Some kind of cruel way to humiliate her before he inevitably told her to pack her things and leave. She wasn't naive enough to believe in miracles. Her voice was careful when she finally spoke. Sir, with all due respect, I don't understand. Ethan leaned back in his chair. His piercing blue eyes locked onto her like a hawk surveying its prey. Simple. You say you're not lazy, that you can work hard. I want to see that for myself. Claire frowned. By making me your assistant. He smirked, swirling the whiskey in his glass before taking a slow sip. Not an assistant. More like an experiment. Her fingers clenched against the fabric of her uniform. An experiment. Like she was some kind of test subject for his amusement. She should have been angry. Should have told him where he could shove his so-called opportunity. But she couldn't afford to. If this was her only chance to keep her job, and possibly earn more, then she had no choice but to take it. All right, she said, forcing her voice to stay even. What exactly would my responsibilities be? Ethan studied her, as if assessing whether she was actually up for the challenge. Then he placed his glass down and folded his hands together. You'll be shadowing me, running errands, handling minor tasks. I want to see how well you adapt. Claire hesitated. But I have no experience in office work. You have common sense, don't you? His tone was teasing, but there was an edge beneath it. Or are you backing out already? Her spine stiffened. Oh, I'll do it. Ethan's lips curled into a smirk. Good. Then be here at 7 a.m. sharp. Her stomach twisted. That was barely 4 hours after her night shift ended. But she bit her tongue and nodded. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her hesitate. Ethan glanced at his watch. You should go home. Get some rest. You'll need it. She stood, resisting the urge to roll her eyes at his arrogance. But as she reached the door, she paused. Why are you doing this? His expression didn't change, but something unreadable flickered in his eyes. Because I can. Claire exhaled sharply and left the office, her mind spinning. She had walked in expecting to be fired. Now, she was apparently being tested by the most powerful man in the company. She didn't know whether this was an opportunity or a setup for failure. Either way, she wasn't going down without a fight. The next morning, Claire arrived at Lancaster Enterprises 10 minutes early, wearing the best outfit she could put together. A simple white blouse and a black skirt that was slightly too big on her but presentable enough. She had borrowed it from a neighbor, promising to return it by the end of the week. Her nerves were shot from lack of sleep, but she forced herself to stay sharp. As soon as she stepped off the elevator, she was met with the sight of a tall woman with dark red lipstick and sharp eyes, typing furiously on a tablet. She barely spared Claire a glance before saying, "You must be the new experiment." Claire bristled at the term but nodded. "I'm Claire Bennett. Margaret," the woman introduced herself curtly. "I'm Mr. Lancaster's executive assistant. That means I'm your boss before he is." "Understood." Claire swallowed her pride and nodded. "Understood." Margaret exhaled, glancing at her watch. "Your job is simple. Do what he asks, stay out of his way, and don't embarrass him. If you last more than 3 days, I'll be impressed." Claire squared her shoulders. "I plan to last longer than that." Margaret let out a dry chuckle. "We'll see." She gestured for Claire to follow. "Come on, he's waiting." Claire walked into Ethan's office to find him seated at his desk, already immersed in a stack of documents. Without looking up, he gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Sit." She obeyed, trying to keep her nerves in check. Ethan finally lifted his gaze, taking her in. "You're early. You told me to be here at 7. He smirked slightly. "Most people in your position would have overslept." She met his gaze evenly. "I'm not most people." Something flickered in his eyes before he slid a document toward her. "This is today's schedule. You'll be following me to all my meetings. Pay attention. Learn fast." Claire picked up the paper, scanning the itinerary. His entire day was packed. Meetings with board members, a lunch with investors, calls with international clients. It was overwhelming just to look at. Ethan leaned back, watching her reaction. "Think you can handle it?" She lifted her chin. "Yes." His smirk deepened, as if amused by her confidence. "We'll see." The day moved at a pace Claire wasn't prepared for. Ethan was relentless. He moved from one meeting to the next without missing a beat, completely in control of every conversation. She watched as executives twice his age deferred to him, as investors hung on his every word. He was intimidating, brilliant, and utterly exhausting to keep up with. At lunch, he barely paused to eat, instead taking calls while his assistant, Margaret, handed him files. Claire did her best to absorb everything, scribbling notes in a small notepad she had brought with her. Ethan glanced at her once, raising an eyebrow. "You take notes?" She nodded. "I learn better that way." For the first time, something like approval flashed in his expression, but it was gone in an instant. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, Claire's feet ached, and her brain felt like it had been put through a blender. But she refused to show any sign of exhaustion. As they stepped into the elevator to head down to the lobby, Ethan studied her. "You lasted the entire day. Impressive," she exhaled. "Was that another test?" "Everything's a test, Claire." She shook her head. "Do you always push people this hard?" His lips quirked. "Only the ones I find interesting." Her breath hitched slightly at the way he said it, but she quickly masked her reaction. She wasn't going to let herself get caught up in whatever game Ethan Lancaster was playing. When the elevator doors opened, he turned to her. "Be here at 6 tomorrow." Her jaw nearly dropped. 6. He smirked. "Unless you're backing out." She clenched her fists. "I'll be here." Ethan's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he nodded. "Good." And then, just like that, he walked away, disappearing into the sea of high-powered executives leaving for the day. Claire exhaled, rubbing her temples. This was going to be the longest week of her life. But if Ethan thought she was going to break, he was in for a surprise. She wasn't just here to survive. She was here to win. The next morning, Claire arrived at Lancaster Enterprises at precisely 5:55 a.m. She wasn't about to give Ethan Lancaster the satisfaction of catching her late. She had barely slept, her body aching from exhaustion, but sheer determination fueled her steps. As she approached the executive floor, she half expected to find an empty office, but to her surprise, Ethan was already at his desk, flipping through reports as if he had been there for hours. He looked effortlessly put together, his crisp navy suit tailored to perfection, his sleeves rolled up just enough to hint at strong forearms. He barely looked up as she walked in. 5 minutes early. Not bad. Claire crossed her arms. "I told you, I'm not most people." That smirk again, as if she amused him more than she should. He set down his pen and gestured toward a stack of folders on the desk. "Start with these. Review the reports, summarize the key points, and highlight anything that stands out." Claire frowned as she picked up the first document. "You know I don't have experience with this." "You have a brain, don't you?" Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Figure it out." Her fingers tightened around the folder, but she bit her tongue. Fine. If he wanted to test her, she'd play along. The next few hours were brutal. Claire read through reports filled with financial jargon she barely understood, struggling to make sense of revenue streams, projected earnings, and cost analyses. But she refused to give up. Every time she hit a term she didn't recognize, she searched for explanations on her phone. Every number she didn't understand, she cross-checked until it clicked. At 9 a.m., Ethan had his first meeting of the day. Claire sat beside him, taking notes, watching as he controlled the room with sharp, decisive words. At 11 a.m., an investor called, and Ethan handed her a file, expecting her to summarize the report on the spot. Her heart pounded, but she managed to deliver a concise overview. He said nothing after, but she didn't miss the flicker of approval in his gaze. At noon, Margaret pulled her aside, raising a brow. "You're still here." Claire wiped the sweat from her brow. "Why does everyone keep acting surprised?" Margaret smirked. "Because most people crack under the pressure." Claire lifted her chin. "I'm not most people." Margaret chuckled. "All right then. Let's see how long you last." By the time lunch rolled around, Claire's stomach was grumbling in protest. She hadn't eaten since last night, and the exhaustion was starting to take its toll. Ethan had just wrapped up a call when he turned to her. "You eat yet?" She hesitated. "Not yet." He didn't respond, simply stood and grabbed his suit jacket. "Come with me." Confused, Claire followed him downstairs to the company's private dining hall, a restaurant-style lounge exclusive to executives. The moment they stepped inside, Claire felt out of place. The walls were sleek, the lighting dim and elegant, and the scent of expensive cuisine filled the air. Ethan led her to a corner table, pulling out his phone as a waiter approached. "The usual," he said. Then, without looking up, he added, "And whatever she wants." Claire blinked. "Wait, I can order." Ethan finally looked at her, an amused glint in his eyes. "That's how restaurants work." He scowled. I know that. I just didn't think. Claire. His voice was calm but firm. Order. She swallowed hard and quickly glanced at the menu. Everything was ridiculously expensive. Finally, she settled on something simple. Grilled chicken with a side of vegetables. The waiter nodded and disappeared. Claire shifted uncomfortably. Why are we eating here? I thought you didn't mix business with, she hesitated. Ethan arched a brow. With what? With people like me. His smirk faded. He leaned forward slightly, fingers tapping against the table. And what exactly do you think you are, Claire? Her throat went dry. Cleaning lady. Or at least I was. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. Let me tell you something about people, Claire. He lifted his glass, swirling the amber liquid inside. Everyone wants to put themselves into neat little categories. Bitch, or Theo, janitor. But at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is who can survive. He took a sip before adding, so tell me, Claire, can you survive? Her heartbeat thundered. She met his gaze head-on. Yes. A slow smile spread across his lips. Good. After lunch, the intensity didn't let up. Ethan was ruthless, throwing her tasks that forced her to think on her feet. At one point, he had her organize a set of contracts, only for him to randomly ask for a specific clause mid-meeting. When she flipped to the exact page without hesitation, he barely nodded, but the flicker of approval was there. By 8 p.m., Claire was running on pure adrenaline. She had lasted another day. But as the office finally emptied out and silence settled over the building, exhaustion hit her like a freight train. She slumped into a chair, rubbing her temples. Ethan glanced at her from his desk. Tired? Claire groaned. Understatement. He smirked, standing. Come on. She frowned. Come on where? Ethan grabbed his keys. I'm driving you home. Her eyes widened. Well, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, he interrupted smoothly. But I'm doing it anyway. Claire hesitated. Letting Ethan Lancaster drive her home felt like crossing some invisible line, but her body ached too much to argue. Reluctantly, she followed him to the underground garage, where a sleek black Aston Martin waited. He stared. Of course you drive a car like this. Ethan smirked. Disappointed. No, she muttered, sliding into the passenger seat. Just predictable. He chuckled as he started the engine. The ride was silent at first, the low hum of the car filling the space between them. But as they neared her neighborhood, Ethan finally spoke. Why do you work so hard, Claire? She glanced at him. Why do you? His grip on the wheel tightened slightly. Claire exhaled. Told you. I have responsibilities. Ethan didn't respond immediately, but when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. Who are you taking care of? She hesitated before answering. My little brother. He's in high school. Ethan nodded, as if that explained everything. Maybe in some way it did. When they reached her apartment, Claire unbuckled her seatbelt and turned to him. Thanks for the ride. Ethan's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. Be ready at 6 tomorrow. She rolled her eyes. I know. As she stepped out of the car, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. Something subtle. Something dangerous. And for the first time she wondered, was Ethan testing her? Or was he challenging himself to see how far he could push her? Either way, she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, Claire woke up feeling like she had been hit by a truck. Her muscles screamed in protest, her eyelids felt heavier than bricks, and every part of her body begged for just a few more hours of sleep. But 6 sharp meant 6 sharp. Ethan Lancaster wouldn't accept excuses. Dragging herself out of bed, she got ready as fast as she could, stuffing a slice of toast in her mouth while tying her hair back. Her little brother, Noah, barely stirred on the couch, muttering something about her needing a real job that didn't try to kill her. She ignored him. By the time she stepped outside, the black Aston Martin was already parked at the curb. Claire stopped in her tracks. He came to pick her up. Again. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing Ethan's infuriatingly calm expression. "You're 3 minutes late," she huffed, crossing her arms. "I had to actually wake up, unlike some people." He smirked. "Get in." She hesitated but ultimately sighed and climbed into the car. The second she was seated, he accelerated, merging into the early morning traffic with the ease of someone who didn't know what it was like to be rushed. Claire glanced at him. "You do realize I can take the bus, right?" Ethan didn't look away from the road. "You could. But you won't." Her brows furrowed. "And why is that?" He smirked. "Because I don't want to waste time waiting for you to get stuck in public transportation delays." Claire rolled her eyes. Course. It wasn't about kindness. It was about efficiency. Typical Ethan Lancaster. By the time they arrived at the office, Claire was wide awake, fueled more by the silent challenge in Ethan's gaze than by actual energy. The day started exactly like the last. Fast, brutal, and exhausting. But this time, Claire wasn't just surviving. She was keeping up. She filed reports before Ethan could even ask. She summarized meetings in precise bullet points. She even handled a miscommunication between 2 departments before it escalated, earning a raised brow from Margaret and the smallest nod of approval from Ethan. At noon, Ethan surprised her again. "Come," he said, standing from his desk. Claire frowned. "Come where?" "Lunch." She hesitated. Again. Ethan's smirk deepened. "Unless you prefer starving." Claire exhaled, following him reluctantly. This time, he didn't take her to the executive dining hall. Instead, he led her outside the building, past the sea of expensive restaurants, and toward a small hole-in-the-wall diner tucked between 2 towering skyscrapers. She blinked as she stepped inside, the scent of coffee and fresh bread filling the air. It was cozy, the kind of place normal people ate at, not billionaires. Ethan slid into a booth like he had done it 100 times before. Claire hesitantly followed, still watching him like he was some kind of puzzle she couldn't quite solve. The owner, an elderly woman, walked up with a warm smile. "Ethan dear, it's been a while." Ethan's expression softened, just slightly. "Been busy, Martha." The woman chuckled. "You're always busy." Then she turned to Claire, eyes twinkling. "And who's this?" Claire opened her mouth, unsure of what to say, but Ethan beat her to it. "This is Claire." That was it. No title, no explanation. Just Claire. Martha smiled knowingly. "Well, any friend of Ethan's is welcome here. What can I get you, sweetheart?" Claire glanced at the menu, still confused, but eventually ordered a sandwich and coffee. Ethan ordered without even looking, like he already knew the menu by heart. As they waited for their food, Claire leaned forward, arms resting on the table. "Okay, spill." Ethan arched a brow. "Spill what?" She gestured around the diner. "This place." "A billionaire eating at a tiny diner like this." "Explain." He smirked. "Not everything in my life is about luxury, Claire." She scoffed. "Really?" "Because the custom-tailored suits and million-dollar car say otherwise." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Martha's been running this place since I was a teenager. My father used to bring me here before he paused, just for a fraction of a second before continuing. Before he got too busy." Claire caught the flicker of something in his expression, a shadow of something deeper. But before she could ask, the food arrived, and just like that, the moment was gone. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from 2 people trying to figure each other out. And for the first time, Claire wondered if there was more to Ethan Lancaster than just money and power. The rest of the day passed in a blur of work, deadlines, and near-constant movement. By the time it was 10 p.m., Claire felt like her brain was melting. But she had made it through another day. As they left the office, Ethan walked beside her, hands in his pockets. "You're improving," he said casually. Claire smirked, exhausted but satisfied. "Don't sound so surprised." He chuckled. "I'm not." They reached the car, but before Ethan could unlock it, a figure appeared out of the shadows. Claire tensed immediately. It was a man mid-40s, disheveled, his eyes wild with anger. "You think you can just ignore me, Lancaster?" The man spat, voice slurred with alcohol. Ethan barely reacted, his expression cold and unreadable. "Go home, Daniel." Claire's stomach twisted. "Who was this?" Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Home? I don't have a damn home because of you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You did that to yourself." The man took a threatening step closer. "Whoa, you did this." Before Claire could even react, Ethan smoothly stepped in front of her. His stance was relaxed, but there was a dangerous edge in his posture, like a lion watching its prey. Daniel's gaze flickered to Claire, sneering. "And who's this?" "Another one of your disposable employees." Claire clenched her fists, but before she could say anything, Ethan's voice cut through the air like ice. "Walk away, Daniel. Now." Something in his tone must have scared the man, because after a tense moment, he scoffed and staggered back. "You'll get what's coming to you, Lancaster." Then he disappeared into the night. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Ethan turned to her. "Are you all right?" She nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. "Who was that?" Ethan hesitated for just a second before answering. "No one important." Claire didn't believe him for a second. As Ethan unlocked the car, Claire stole one last glance at the dark alley where the man had disappeared. Something about the encounter didn't sit right. And as she climbed into the passenger seat, she realized something else. Ethan Lancaster wasn't just a ruthless CEO. He had secrets. And she had a feeling she had just stepped into something far more dangerous than she ever expected. Claire sat in the passenger seat, her mind racing. The encounter with Daniel left a lingering unease in her stomach. She stole a glance at Ethan as he drove. His grip on the wheel was firm. His jaw clenched just slightly. He was affected. She wasn't sure what bothered her more, the fact that some stranger had threatened him or the fact that Ethan had shut down completely afterward. She had seen different versions of Ethan Lancaster over the past few days. The arrogant CEO, the relentless boss, the man who thrived on control. But this was different. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Claire exhaled. "Are you going to tell me who he was?" Ethan didn't look at her. "I already told you. No one important." Claire scoffed. "Right. Because no one important usually shows up in dark alleys, screaming about how you ruined their life." Ethan's fingers tightened on the steering wheel, but his voice remained composed. "It's not your concern." She turned fully toward him. "Not my concern. Seriously. I just watched some guy practically threaten you in the middle of the night, and you're telling me to ignore it?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Claire, drop it." Something about his tone, the exhaustion beneath it, made her hesitate. But only for a second. She crossed her arms. "You know, for someone who prides himself on being in control, you're terrible at handling real problems." Ethan let out a sharp laugh, but it wasn't amused. It was hollow. "And what exactly do you think a real problem is, Claire?" She stared at him. "You tell me." For the first time, Ethan glanced at her, just briefly. And in that moment, Claire swore she saw something raw behind those dark eyes. Something dangerous. But just as quickly it was gone. The car slowed as they reached her apartment building. Ethan pulled up to the curb, his gaze fixed ahead. "Get some rest," he said. His voice was distant. Claire clenched her jaw, debating whether to push further. But deep down, she knew Ethan Lancaster was a fortress, one that wouldn't crumble just because she knocked a few times. "For now," she sighed, grabbing her bag. "Fine. Good night." As she stepped out of the car and shut the door, she expected him to drive off immediately. But he didn't. He sat there for a moment, fingers tapping against the wheel. Then, just before he pulled away, he did something that caught her completely off guard. He looked back at her, just for a second, then he was gone. The next morning, Claire arrived at Lancaster Enterprises feeling a mix of exhaustion and frustration. She had barely slept. She kept replaying the scene in her head. Daniel's words, Ethan's reaction, the way his entire demeanor had shifted afterward. Something was wrong, and Claire hated not knowing what. She pushed through the day as usual, determined not to let her thoughts distract her. But it was hard when Ethan was acting like nothing had happened. By noon she had had enough. She found him in his office, reviewing documents. Without knocking, she marched in and dropped a folder on his desk. Ethan arched a brow. "I don't recall asking for dramatics." Claire crossed her arms. "I don't recall agreeing to be left in the dark." His expression remained unreadable. "I told you to drop it. And I told you I wouldn't." Ethan exhaled slowly. He set down his pen, leaning back in his chair. "Why do you care so much?" The question caught her off guard. Claire opened her mouth, but no words came out. Why did she care? Ethan was her boss. Her temporary boss at that. A week ago he was just a name on a door. A man who lived in a world she would never be part of. But now she had seen glimpses of him he didn't show to anyone else. Now she wasn't sure if she could pretend she didn't see him. "I just do," she finally muttered. "And you're deflecting." Ethan's lips twitched, but it wasn't quite a smirk. After a long pause he finally spoke. Daniel was a former business partner. He made some bad deals, took some risks that didn't pay off. When things went south he wanted me to cover for him. I didn't. Claire frowned. "And now he blames you." Ethan nodded. People don't like taking responsibility for their own mistakes. Something in his tone told her there was more to the story. Much more. But before she could press, his phone buzzed. His expression darkened instantly. Claire saw the caller ID before he flipped the phone over, face down. It read, "Unknown number." Her stomach twisted. Ethan. But he was already standing. "Meeting. Don't wait up." And just like that he was gone. Hours passed, but Ethan never returned. By 8 p.m. Claire was pacing his office, her gut telling her something was off. He had never just disappeared like this. She checked her phone, no messages. Margaret walked by the door, pausing when she saw Claire still there. "He left." Claire nodded. "You don't know where he went." Margaret hesitated. Then, lowering her voice, she said, "Ethan doesn't just leave unannounced. If he did, it's serious." Claire's pulse quickened. She didn't know why she felt like something was wrong, but she did. And she wasn't going to ignore it. By 10 p.m., Claire made a decision. She grabbed her phone, took a deep breath, and did something she never thought she'd do. She called him. Rang. Once. Claire. Her heart nearly stopped. His voice was different. Rough. Trained. Something was wrong. "Ethan," she breathed. "Where are you?" "You shouldn't be calling me." Claire's stomach twisted. "Ethan, what's going on?" Silence. Then, just before he could hang up, she heard something in the background. A loud crash. Followed by a muffled voice. Then the call cut off. Claire froze. For a split second, she debated if she had imagined it. She was reading too much into things. But her gut screamed otherwise. And for the first time since meeting Ethan Lancaster, Claire felt something she hadn't before. Fear. Not for herself. For him. And she had a feeling this was just the beginning.